In my last video, I addressed the question of who was using steroids in the so-called steroid era, specifically whether it was mainly home run hitters. But this touches on a bigger question, which is how many players were using steroids in the first place. And this is a tricky area, and I admit to being more confused on this subject than I am on many of the others I've talked about in previous videos. The fact is, it's basically impossible to know exactly how common steroid use was in the 1990s because no testing was in place, and we can't trust players from that era to be completely honest or reliable narrators of what happened. Memory is fallible, and different players have different incentives to exaggerate or downplay how common it was. Even now, steroid testing isn't really reliable enough to give us precise numbers on who is using what and when. So I'm not going to be able to give a precise answer to the question of who was using steroids in the steroid era, but in this video I'd like to do two things. One, to go over how a certain type of conventional wisdom got established and why I think that's wrong. And two, to provide a competing hypothesis, which might also be wrong, but does, to me, fit the available evidence that we have better. So let's start with one, addressing this so-called conventional wisdom. As I said in my last video, the original image of a steroid guy was a big-muscled home run hitter, someone like Jose Canseco, Mark McGwire, Barry Bonds, Ken Caminiti. But as more and more players were exposed as steroid guys, fans started to notice that the guys who failed drug tests or who were connected to Balco or biogenesis did not actually conform to that image. It was a lot of smaller players, pinch runners, relief pitchers, backup catchers, guys like that. So the standard reaction, the conventional wisdom, was just to say, well, it could have been anyone. The whole era is tainted. Everyone from the 1990s and beyond may have been on steroids. The word that always pops up is widespread. Steroid use in this era was supposedly widespread. The Mitchell report, when it came out in 2007, used that word at least 9 times to describe steroid use.
9 times?
9 times.
And ever since then, it's been the go-to adjective for people describing the steroid era. Widespread. And you can see why people would think this. After all types of players seem to pop up among steroid users. Home run hitters, speed and defense guys, starting pitchers, relief pitchers, backup catchers, utility infielders. You name it, you could find a steroid user who fit that description. So widespread seemed to be correct. But what does widespread really mean? I think the reason people love this word is it can mean anything. It sounds almost like it means everyone, like 80 to 90%. That sounds widespread to me. But even the Mitchell report never comes close to claiming a percentage that high. The most common number cited in that document, which is not friendly to steroid users, is around 30%, which I guess counts as widespread, but it's obviously less than half. And if you look closer, you see that even those estimates are just guesses based on vibes more than any evidence. If you actually look at the evidence, the 30% number seems way too high. Since Major League Baseball started its drug testing regime back in 2005, there have never been more than 11 failed tests in a single season, and even that high was recorded in the program's first year. Ever since then, it's been more like 7 or 8 per year, sometimes as few as 1 or 2. And yet baseball conducts thousands of tests per season. That positivity rate is less than 1%. In the minor leagues, testing numbers are roughly the same. In 2001, then-Commissioner Bud Selig implemented steroid testing for minor leaguers, and in that first year, about 9% of tests were positive. The next year, 2002, the number fell to around 4%. In 2004, the number was 1.7%, and by 2006, it was 0.36%. Of course, the conventional wisdom is also that these tests are unreliable because they are so easy to beat. People say steroid tests are not a drug test, they're an intelligence test. And I'm open to this idea, I'm sympathetic to it, but I have to say, they don't seem that easy to beat to me. After all, several big stars have failed steroid tests. Someone like Robinson Cano lost a total of $36 million in salary because he failed multiple drug tests. Presumably, if they were so easy to beat, then a multimillionaire who stood to lose $36 million would do whatever easy thing was required to beat them. Additionally, when steroid users are outed through other means, that is through government investigation or the testimony of somebody, they often include people who have also failed drug tests. The Mitchell report, for example, names 85 players, mostly through the testimony of a former clubhouse employee. And even though most of them played before steroid testing was even a part of baseball, a lot of the guys named in that report also eventually failed drug tests. Jason Grimsley, Miguel Tejada, Jose Guillen. When the biogenesis scandal broke in 2013, 7 big leaguers were ultimately suspended for their association with Anthony Bosch, who, if you remember, advertised himself as a genius scientist who would guarantee that you couldn't fail a drug test with his drugs. But of those 7 players, 3 did fail tests. 2 before the scandal broke, Ryan Braun and Melky Cabrera, and then 1 after. In other words, it doesn't seem like there's some secret class of steroid users out there taking undetectable substances. When people like Bosch or Victor Conte talk about how easy it is to beat these tests, it's probably best understood as marketing. Of course, the guy trying to sell you illegal drugs is going to say the drugs are undetectable. Look, obviously these tests are not foolproof. There are plenty of players who use steroids who never fail to test, and there are also, by the way, plenty of players who failed tests who probably shouldn't have because they took something that was tainted or legal in their home country. The list of people who failed drug tests in Major League Baseball is disproportionately foreign-born players who are often suspended for drugs that are legal in the countries in which they took them or live. So I'm not caping for these steroid tests. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not saying we should put too much faith in steroid testing, which is very flawed. What I am saying is that most of the evidence we have suggests that the numbers indicate by the tests are broadly correct. In 1991, there was an anonymous survey conducted of 880 major leaguers, roughly 80% of the league. There were no penalties attached to this survey, and it was conducted by the Players Association, so the players who participated had little reason to fear being outed. Plus, it occurred at a time before there was much stigma around steroid use in baseball. And according to this anonymous survey, only 1.5% of players had ever used anabolic steroids, and only 0.5% had used in the past year. According to the Mitchell report, quote, while the study's authors acknowledged that underreporting was certainly a possibility, participating players admitted use of amphetamines and certain serious drugs of abuse at much higher rates. The study's authors concluded that there is little indication of lying, and the obtained rates should be taken as reliable but conservative estimates. Now, obviously steroid use increased throughout the 90s, but even in 2003, when baseball did its first round of survey testing, the number of positive tests was between 5 and 7%. The reason there's some ambiguity is that there were 96 total failed tests, but the union challenged the scientific validity of 13 of them. Those 13 tests in dispute were never retested because the number was above the 5% cutoff either way. So the number is somewhere between 83 and 96 positive, which is somewhere between 5 and 7% of the total. But even if we take the upper bound of that number is well below the 30% estimate in the Mitchell report and way below what I would call widespread. It suggests that even at steroids' peak, 90% of players were clean. Of course, if you are committed to the conventional wisdom that steroid use really was widespread and most players really were using, then you can find ways to poke holes in the data. The testing is flawed, players can lie on surveys, most steroid dealers never get caught, and all of that might be true. But where is there any hard evidence anywhere that steroid use ever reached that 30% number, let alone a clear majority of players? Other than a couple of guesses in the Mitchell report, it's just totally baseless speculation. The whole thing turns into a kind of McCarthyism, where the ambiguity combines with fans' cynicism about steroids in baseball so that everyone is guilty of the sins of a small number of bad actors, and that ambiguity is used against all players.
There's just one thing, babe. I'd be a lot happier if we could just settle on the number of communists I know there are in the Defense Department. I mean, the way you keep changing the figures on me all the time, it makes me look like some kind of a nut, like an idiot. You know, the boys are even starting to kid me about it. Well, just yesterday in the cloakroom, they said, hey, Johnny.
Well, you're going to look like an even bigger idiot if you don't get in there and do exactly what you're told.
Babe.
Who are they writing about all over this country, and what are they saying? Are they saying, are there any communists in the Defense Department? Of course not. They're saying, how many communists are there in the Defense Department? So just stop talking like an expert all of a sudden and get out there and say what you're supposed to say.
Now, for the second part of this video, I want to go back to how this widespread narrative began and try to make sense of where it came from in the first place. Because it wasn't totally irrational when the early waves of steroid reporting came in to think that practically the whole league was doing it. After all, if Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and Jason Grimsley and F.P. Santangelo were all doing it, then who could you say was innocent? But on the other hand, how can we reconcile that with the evidence suggesting that only a tiny portion of the league was using steroids? In my last video, I brought up the idea of desperation. Who is most likely to use performance-enhancing drugs? Well, someone who is desperate, someone who is insecure about his own performance, someone on the fringes of the major leagues. If you think of Major League Baseball rosters as a bell curve, you have guys on one extreme, your superstars, your MVPs. For examples, today I'm going to use the 2023 Yankees because they were both the team I watched the most and they were eminently mediocre, so they turned out to be pretty representative. Even a mediocre team like the 82 and 80 Yankees had some superstars on it, like Garrett Cole and Aaron Judge. These guys at the extreme end of the distribution. And occasionally, it's true, you'll find a steroid user in this bunch. Someone like Alex Rodriguez or Barry Bonds or McGuire or Clemens or so on and so forth. But as I said in the last video, they're the exceptions. And if steroids gave you a real advantage, you'd expect most users to be in this category when in fact they are not. Then you've got guys in the middle, your solid major leaguers. For last year's Yankees, I'm thinking of somebody like Gleyber Torres. He was fine, worth about 3 wins above replacement. You're not going to be telling your grandkids about 2023 Gleyber Torres, and he's not going to set new records, but every great team needs solid, dependable players like that on the roster. They make good money, they have solid careers. I would kill to be a solid major leaguer. Most players are in this meaty part of the curve, and nowadays, because of the penalties associated with steroid use, they likely don't want to jeopardize their careers by getting caught using drugs. Then you've got guys over here, guys who are just hanging on. Again, on the 23 Yankees, I'm thinking of people like Albert Abreu or Oswaldo Cabrera. Maybe those guys will go on to have great careers, but probably not. Their status in the league is fragile. GMs are constantly trying to upgrade those spots on the roster, and those players are all a couple of bad games away from being replaced. This is the danger zone, the area of desperation. It's players in this category who, based on my hypothesis at least, are most likely to take desperate measures like using performance-enhancing substances. And if you look at the lists of guys who get caught using drugs, whether it's people who failed tests, people who were associated with Balco, or people who were associated with biogenesis, or other steroid rings that are busted, they mostly come from this section of the curve. Now, at any given time, only a small percentage of players are in this danger zone. But it's also true that almost every player at some point in his career passes through this zone. Occasionally there's a player like Mike Trout who comes into the league at age 20, wins Rookie of the Year, and then is an MVP contender for basically forever. But most guys spend some time here, either when they are first breaking into the league, when they're recovering from an injury, when their careers are winding down, or even when they're just going through a bad stretch. And look, obviously it is not a hard and fast rule that players in this zone are going to use steroids. Most guys don't, either because they are ethical, or they're scared of the health risks, or they don't believe that steroids will benefit them. And obviously there are players outside this zone who did use steroids, like Bonds and Manny Ramirez. But this is where you feel the pressure most acutely and where you're going to be the most tempted to try drugs that claim they are performance enhancing. And if you think of it this way, suddenly the conflicting data starts to make a little more sense. The reason steroid rates seem to hover around 1 to 2% is that at any given time, only a small percentage of the league is in this zone, and only a small percentage of them are going to give into temptation and use these drugs. But all kinds of players pass through this zone at some point in their career, from future superstars to former all-stars to relievers to backup catchers to potential Hall of Famers. So all kinds of players will end up experimenting with these drugs. It's not just a group of home run hitters, it's mostly people going through a tough time who believe steroids can help fix them. But importantly, this doesn't tell us anything about how effective steroids are. Whenever I tell people that I'm skeptical of the effects of steroids, the most common response I get is always, well, of course steroids work. Why else would players use them? But players using steroids doesn't prove they were actually effective. It just proves how desperate players in this zone can get to keep their production up and stay in the majors. In just the same way that desperate people are the most likely to buy every drug that markets itself as performance enhancing, whether that's nootropics and brain supplements that advertise on Alec Jones's podcast, or sex pills you can get at your local bodega. Just because some people are desperate enough to buy them doesn't mean these things actually work. The irony is that this conventional wisdom, that steroids make people better at baseball, is the very explanation people are looking for. Well, why would players use steroids if they didn't work? Because people like you keep telling them they do work. Is it any wonder that desperate players resort to these drugs as a way of keeping their careers alive? This is how the steroid myths fuel each other, creating their own little bubble of accepted opinions that are totally removed from the facts we actually have.